I'm saying good morning with a beautiful morning picture here. The weather recently has been magnificent, hasn't it? Like we haven't really had a winter. It's been mild. We've had these beautiful cloudless skies. And I don't know about you, but if I go on holiday and I wake up to something like that, that's pretty exciting. We think, wow, this is just the perfect day. But you would not think that if you were an Israelite in the wilderness. It would be a day of horror to you. Because if you woke up to a cloudless day, it would have meant that God had left your presence. So what we consider to be perfect would have been absolutely terrifying if that had happened to the Israelites. Why? Because they had God's presence in the cloud every day and every night. And as we know, the cloud provided light in the daytime and, a way to go in the daytime and a light for the evening. We'll learn a little bit more about that as we go along this morning. Also, I want to say that we often think today we've woken up to a cloudy day and it's a bit darker, it's a bit greyer. But if you, like me, have travelled on aircraft at all and you've gone up through the clouds and it bumps a bit and you go, right, and you're a little bit worried, and then all of a sudden it breaks through and it's not grey and cloudy, and it's not grey anymore, it is bright white, it's shining. So hence we have every cloud has a silver lining, because the Son of Righteousness is always there whether we see him or not. The sun is shining upon us, and we see glimpses of that even on cloudy days. It's just which side of the cloud we think we're on that makes a difference. And I guess one of the themes of our exhortation this morning is always try and be on the right side of that cloud. And as we'll see, the Israelites realised that that cloud represented great power. It was the power of God. So clouds provide a highlight and contrast between darkness and light. We are in the light, brothers and sisters. We have nothing to fear. We know the sun is behind those clouds. And of course, just historically, the first time we read about clouds, we also read about rainbows, because God set his bow in the cloud, it tells us. And interestingly, God chose a cloud, because we don't really have a rainbow without clouds, do we? God chose a cloud to paint the rainbow on. And so as the clouds were clearing, when Noah came out of the ark, so too that beautiful, no doubt dazzling rainbow that we occasionally see, and no doubt in that day it would have been just outstanding. As that rainbow appeared, the cloud was there to bring out the highlights. So clouds are good. God chose the cloud as his palette to paint the rainbow. This pillar then of cloud God uses, he could have used anything to guide the Israelites through the wilderness. He chose a cloud, right? He could have had anything he wanted to design. He could have had a floating lamp. He could have had anything. Could have had traffic lights if he wanted to. But he chose to have a cloud to guide the Israelites through the wilderness. And I really like this picture, actually. It's a painting, obviously, not a photograph. But what I really like about this is that it shows us how the cloud was there over the presence in the holy place and the most holy place, but it's spreading out across the camp of Israel. And if you notice in the foreground, we've got sheep and so on resting beside the waters, which would have been the river that followed Israel through the wilderness, and they are in shade. And that will become a little bit more powerful as we go on, because that cloud didn't just guide them, it gave them shade, and we will suggest other things as well. So that is a symbol, therefore, of protection. It's powerful, it's guiding, and it's protecting this cloud along the way. It's God's protection to the Israelites. Now, I would like to refer back here. I hope you can read that at the bottom there. This is a quote from the previous chapter to what we read from chapter 13. And it tells us there in chapter 13, verse 21, about the cloud. And I had not really considered this much until thinking a little more on it a few years ago. But it says here that the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and night. So part of the miracle of them coming out of Israel was that they didn't, walk for an hour and have a rest. They just walked and walked. And they didn't stop at, the sun's going down. They kept going. They were able to walk and travel by day and night. That's how they travelled so far and got ahead of the pursuing Egyptians. So that in itself, just like their shoes weren't wearing out, just like their clothes didn't wear out, they were given obviously strength to travel day and night without resting. And for those of us who are getting a little older, that's very, very tempting and an exciting prospect, that we do not get weary as we travel or walk around the block. So, again, this cloud represents the glory of God. It's his protection, but when they saw it, it was God in that cloud. It was Yahweh. So this is trying to build a little picture there. Now, last time I was here, actually, I think I spoke about an alternate crossing in class or something like that I gave. I'm just going to take for granted that you understand I'm a bit strange and think it's not down through the normal way. But what we talked about was that they probably went straight across the Sinai Peninsula, the way that Moses left Egypt and went to Midian. But it tells us at the start of the chapter we've just seen that in verse 1, if you recall when we read that this morning, it said, "The Lord said to Moses, tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea." So if they were going their normal direction, they wouldn't have had to encounter the sea necessarily. However, when they got to this point here, illustrated by the blue, they were told to turn back. Now, if you have a look at the primitive root, it means to turn back, to turn away, to move away from their course they were on. And then they were to go to a place that was by the sea. And so God deliberately led them with the cloud down this path that was not very logical, actually, except that it brought them out into a narrow area, as we know the description is, mountains every other side, and out, and what they had before them was the ocean and the Egyptians coming from behind. And they were terrified. What had this cloud done to them? Right? Is it leading them so that they can indeed die? Well, let's just read a couple of verses again from Exodus chapter 14 that we read this morning. It says, "The angel of God who was going before the host of Israel moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel." We see this dynamic cloud. It's not just sort of floating there doing nothing. It's now decided, I need to protect, as in God. And so this cloud moves radically straight behind where Israel was by the sea and forms this impenetrable barrier that encases the Egyptian host and makes it darkness, total darkness. I don't know if you've ever been in total darkness, where you literally cannot see one little tiny bit of light, but it's a bit scary and a bit foreboding, actually. That is what the Egyptians were in as the cloud dynamically moves and encases them. But at the same time, out the other side, it's providing light all night to the Israelites. You see this great contrast, light and darkness, salvation and destruction, right, between what this cloud could do to save the people of Israel. And it says, and in the morning watch, Yahweh in the pillar of fire and of cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into panic, clogging their chariot wheels. And as we had the reading there from the NIV by Johnny this morning, not the NIV, the New King James, and it said, taking off their chariot wheels. It's almost as though the angels were down there and they said, oh, let's take this chariot wheel off and throw it over here and whoop, over the side, and they have to get up and find the chariot wheel and try and put it back on, delayed them catching the Israelites. And they drove heavily. The Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians. So the Egyptians saw what God was doing, what this cloud had done, and what this host was now being totally demoralised and shaken, and was they had a sense of impending doom because that Yahweh was fighting for them. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, brothers and sisters. I'm sure you have in your life, where it seemed a pretty hopeless road ahead and didn't know where to go. Perhaps you wisely chose to pray, chose to just let everything happen according to God's will, and you came through it. Not always easily, not without scars, not without a few bruises, but you've come through it. Well, that's how Israel was meant to feel. They were meant to feel like that happened. And it tells us, as we just read in the morning watch, they did that. And here's another nice illustration of the Egyptians striving but getting to a point where they knew it was hopeless. And it says, let's flee from them. So in other words, they got part the way in and they decided, oh, let's go back. Let's run away. Let's get going back to where we were on the other side, because this is a bit frightening. And we know what happened, and it closed in about them. Now, such was this event, the opening of the sea, the cloud separating them, the cloud going before them, the angels fixing their wheels and so on so they couldn't pursue, them getting stuck in the middle and the water coming down upon them, and the cloud being triumphant, leading Israel out the other side. This was so spectacular that legend spread abroad right throughout the areas all around, not just in Egypt, but also way up the Levant. How do we know that? Well, Joshua chapter 2. What's it tell us? That 40 years later, a woman in Jericho, Rahab, said, I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. Now, it's a long time for that story to stick. Now, if you imagine, they're looking from Jericho along the plain, Jordan River, and on the other side is Israel. How did they know they were there? Because they could see a cloud. It was there in the encampment on the other side of the Jordan. And they had heard the stories, and Rahab believed in the power of that God that was in that cloud. So 40 years, and it was still on their minds, and they were scared stiff, as she testifies. Now, it was not just that. We have here an Egyptian inscription, which is actually currently in northern Sudan, So it's not actually in Egypt anymore, but of course the Sudan was part of Egypt back then. And it is from the temple, as it says there, at Selbet, and Amenhotep. Shall we try that again? Amenhotep the third. He left this inscription, and it literally says, according to the experts and the interpretation there, it says that's written up there, and translated literally it means that one of his enemies, because he wrote down all the enemies on this particular inscription, his enemies from the south, his enemies from the north, and so on. And one of the enemies he mentioned was the land of the wanderers of Yahweh. So he was writing, as you can see there, just after the time that Israel, or around about the time that Israel had left and were in the land of Israel. It's thought that Israel were, just by way of comparison, they came into the land approximately 1406 BC. So this is less than 100 years later. And he still regarded the people of the land as the wanderers of Yahweh, who had been wandering through the wilderness. And they inhabited that land. They were his enemies. And so archaeology again has managed to tell us again of that the legend is true, the power of the God of the cloud. And it reminds me, anyway, of Hebrews 13, where it says, "For here we have no lasting city, but we seek a city to come." We seek the true city of the wanderers of Yahweh. We're surely wanderers of Yahweh now. We're seeking a city, and it's coming. We have the assurance of the God of heaven that is coming. Now, going forward again into the New Testament, brothers and sisters, we're reminded that this whole episode... Sorry, I'm in somebody's way here. The whole episode that we have of them passing through in the cloud, it tells us, was around, behind, and in front of them. In other words, water was totally around the Israelites as they went through the Red Sea. And it was a powerful symbol, yes, of saving them then, but it's a symbol of what baptism does, as it tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:2, that they are all baptised into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And so this, again, is a wonderful portent for something that was happening later, and that was the revelation of the Messiah. They were all baptised. So this cloud has been very, very, very significant in the history of Israel. I want to reflect a little bit again on that picture and Psalm 121, where it says, "The Lord is your keeper. Yahweh is your shade on your right hand." Personally, I think that this is a reflection of the shade that was given to the people of Israel through the wilderness. Now, they endured 40 years wandering through that land. And it's a very, very hot place, all through that Negev and that Arabian Peninsula, in the summertime in particular, and a very, very cold place in the winter. However, if you've got cloud cover, which you don't normally have in that area, you have shade. If you have shade, you have protection from the sun, but also, interestingly, you have a microclimate in the winter too, because it also insulates. And so God, by this cloud, perhaps, and I think strongly perhaps, was providing a moderate temperature for the people of Israel in their journeys through that wilderness. And not only did that happen, but it also tells us in Judges chapter 5 and verse 4 that Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped, yes, the clouds dropped water. Could it have been that this actual cloud provided them with rain along the way as well? We know there was water that was coming from the stream from Mount Horeb, but was there also rain? It seems to indicate here, and also again in Psalm 68. O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah, the earth quaked, the heavens poured down rain before God, the one of Sinai. Before God, the God of Israel, rain in abundance. O God, you shed abroad, you restored your inheritance as it languished. I hadn't read that before, just thinking about this theme. But that's telling us there was a lot of rain where Israel travelled in the wilderness. And could it have been that God also produced with that cloud that rain? What was the purpose of that? It was refreshing, it was cooling, it provided a humidity in the non-humid area. It provided rain that would have generated growth. Why would they need growth around them? Because they had animals with them. The animals, we're not told, ate the manna, but we know they would have drunk the water, but they had to have something to eat on their way as well. So perhaps the rain from the cloud that had provided this microclimate following Israel through the wilderness was fully, and not just a cloud, but it was all they needed, all that Israel required if they stayed underneath that cloud. Something to think about. Can't prove it for sure, but there's certainly some strong indications. When we think about Jesus, when we think about the reason why we're here, brothers and sisters, it's because later that symbol, that total symbol of God's salvation that was seen in that cloud was seen in Jesus. And interestingly, in Acts 1, it tells us that when he finished his ministry, as the disciples were looking up, he was lifted up and a cloud took him out of their presence, out of their sight. I don't know about you, brothers and sisters, but I would have, if it was me and up to my design, I would have had a peerless day. I would have had bright sunshine shining on the Son of Man and being able to let everyone see him rise and rise and rise into the sky, uninhibited. But God chose to take him with a cloud. The cloud was still important in God's purpose and his protection and his saving his people. So this cloud took Jesus. And we know the rest of the story, don't we? Oh, I've left it out. I haven't. At the end of Matthew 26, and of course Matthew 26 is our common reading for the emblems, but at the end of that chapter, it tells us, Jesus said unto them, you've said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming in clouds. It's not the end of the story. He's going to come in clouds. He's going to finish the work of that cloud that he introduced in the wilderness. And it will be when Jesus returns and that kingdom is established and the cloud of his presence will be there in Jerusalem. Just think it's amazing. Some things that certainly if I was designing it, it wouldn't have happened that way. But God saw this cloud as important. So as we take bread and drink wine this morning, brothers and sisters, let's reflect on all those other things that can be brought to mind. And our Anne's managed to put together some hymns this morning that reflect some of the references in our hymn book to clouds and so on, which is amazing. Thanks, Anne. And also you can think of all other things, like in Hebrews about the cloud of witnesses, etc. It's an amazing subject, which I hope I've just sort of perhaps spawned a little bit of thinking power in you, that we take bread and drink wine because of the protective will of our Father in providing Jesus, taking him to heaven and returning him in the clouds.